Alex sir, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir, for joining, sir. Uh, so, may I now request our Vice Chancellor to give us permission to start the program?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Good evening, everyone. I, Prashant Kumar Sharma, an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, Bidhan Chandra College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. And on behalf of the Department of Political Science, warmly welcome you all to this international webinar entitled Mapping India's Position in China's Indo-Pacific Strategy. This webinar has been organized by the Department of Political Science in association with Internal Quality Assurance Cell IQAC, Vidhan Chandra College. We have got Professor Srikant Kondapalli and Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi as the distinguished resource person for this international webinar. It is my honor to introduce these two distinguished resource persons. May I now introduce Professor Srikant Kondapalli sir. Professor Srikant Kondapalli sir is Dean of School of International Studies and Professor in Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was Chairman of the Center for East Asian Studies, SIS JNU from 2008 to 2010, 2012 to 2014, 2016 to 2018, and 2018 to 2020. He is educated in Chinese studies in India and China with a PhD in Chinese studies. He learned Chinese language at Beijing Language and Culture University and was a postdoctoral visiting fellow at People's University, Beijing from 1996 to 1998. He was a visiting professor at National Chengxi University, Taipei in 2004, a visiting fellow at China Institute for Contemporary International Relations, Beijing in May 2007, an honorary professor at Shandong University, Jinan in 2009, 2011, 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2019, and also an honorary professor at Jilin University, Jiangsu in 2014, and at Yunnan University of Finance and Economics, Kunming in 2016 and 2017, a non-resident senior fellow at People's University since 2014, and a fellow at Salzburg's Global Seminar in 2010. He wrote two books, China's Military, the PLA in Transition in 1919, and China's Naval Power in 2001. He wrote two monographs and co-edited 6 volumes, Asian Security and China in 2004, China and its neighbors in 2010, China's military and India in 2012, China and the BRICS setting up a different kitchen in 2016, One Belt, One Road, China's global outreach in 2017, and China and COVID-19, domestic and external dimensions in 2020, and a number of articles in journals and edited volumes, and all on China. He received the K. Subramaniam Award in 2010 for excellence in research in strategic and security studies. He is a guest faculty at Indian Armed Forces Unit, including at the National Defense College, Army War College, College of Air Warfare, College of Naval Warfare, and College of Defense Management. He is a distinguished fellow at several think tanks, including Vivekananda International Foundation and Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. He supervised about 30 PhD researchers at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and is also an academic advisor for PhD researchers at Kazakh National University and Ablai Khan University at Almaty and Tamkhang University, Taipei. He is editor of Jawaharlal Nehru University SIS International Journal, SIS International Studies Journal, which is published by SAGE. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. May I now introduce Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi, sir. Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi, sir, is professor at the Kyoto University Graduate School of System Design and Management, reading international political economy and Japanese diplomacy. He was also a special advisor to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet. Mr. Until Mr. Abe stepped down as Prime Minister on the 16th September 2020. Between February 2013 and March 2014, he was Councillor, Prime Minister's Office. Throughout the period of more than 90 consecutive months, his responsibilities included writing foreign policy speeches for Mr. Abe. After spending 20 years with Nikkei Business, a weekly magazine, he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2005 as Deputy Press Secretary and Deputy Director General for Public Diplomacy. Until he left the ministry 3 years later, he addressed the English-speaking press and wrote speeches for then Foreign Minister Taro Aso and other leaders, including then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. While with the magazine, he spent a stint in London 1997 to 2000 as the magazine's correspondent. In 1999, the then Foreign Press Association in London elected him president, the first from the east of Suez. During his journalistic career, he spent sabbaticals at Woodrow Wilson School, Princeton University, as a Fulbright visiting fellow, at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, and at the Brookings Institution as a paid CNA-PS fellow. For 5 years till 2013, he was executive advisor to the then chairman of Central Japan Railway Company, Kasai Yoshiyuki, while holding visiting professorship at the Kyoto SDM and Meiji University, School of Global Japanese Studies, LLB from the University of Tokyo, doctorate in national security from Takusoku University. He has authored or co-authored more than 10 books on international affairs. One of his latest books, entitled If Put into English, Truth Be Told of Shinzo Abe, was his own account of Abe's leadership. He has appeared live numerous times on BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, TRT, etc. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. It is an honor for all of us to have you with us. May I now request to our head of the institution, Dr. Ramesh Kaur, our Vice Principal, sir, to kindly deliver a formal vote of, kindly deliver a welcome address. Sir, now it's over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Honorable distinguished research person, other dignitaries, dear colleague, research scholars, conveners, and affectionate students. It is really a great pleasure and privilege to be present in the international webinar organized by the Department of Political Science in association with IQAC Vidhan Chandra College, Risuda. Being the head of the institute, I must congratulate the teachers and students of the Department of Political Science, especially HOD, Professor Devdas De, and conveners, Professor Prasant Kumar Sharma, as they have taken initiative to organize the international webinar. First of all, I, on behalf of Institute, must welcome the respected research person, Professor Srikant Kandapalli, Dean, School of International Studies, JNU, New Delhi, and Professors Tomohiko Taneguchi, Special Advisor to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan. I would be immensely grateful as they have responded to our invitation despite their busy schedule. I convey my best wishes to our governing body president, Dr. Sudipto Rai, and all governing body members for moral support to organize the international webinar. I do hope that our participant would reap a sound harvest from the day's discussion. I firmly believe that the day's discussion will be interesting and interactive one. The survey of the day speech and reciprocal discussion, I do hope, would further illumine the minds of the teachers and taught. I wish a warm success of the day's webinar. Once again, thanking you all.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh Kar. And thank you very much, Professor Prashant Kumar Sharma. It's been a pleasure and tremendous honor for me to be with Professor Kondapalli, whom I have admired for many, many years. He is the foremost expert on China studies in India and beyond. He is a world-renowned professor in the field of studying China. Now, no webinar is timelier because the actions that China may or may not take in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to gather world attention from the world, across the world. It's been very much an exciting development, and few scholars, either in Japan, India, or elsewhere, would be better fit than Professor Kondapalli in sharing his views and thoughts and ideas based on long engagement in China with us all. So without further ado, I would like to give microphone to Professor Kondapalli, but before that, here is a very small piece of housekeeping announcement. Please put one short question each to the chat box. That way, I will gather questions from the audience. Make sure your question is going to be short and one piece, and please put it to the chat box. Okay, I've been looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Professor Kondapalli, microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Taniguchi-sensei. And let me also thank the organizers, the Bidhan Chandra College, Rishabh, Calcutta, for organizing this timely webinar. Thank you very much for the invite. So the topic that was mentioned is mapping India's position in China's Indo-Pacific strategy. So there are two things here. One is India's position. Second is China's IP strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy. China doesn't recognize the Indo-Pacific. They have never used the word Indo-Pacific. They continue to use the words Asia-Pacific. So my job is simple because the Chinese never use the word Indo-Pacific, least of all an Indo-Pacific strategy. Nevertheless, I think we need to recognize that there is a certain Indo-Pacific strategy independent of China. And so China has to respond, which is what the strategy would mean. So these two things are important here. One is China's Indo-Pacific strategy, which exists, but it responds to the stimuli. And how do we map India's position among these? India's position also is quite simple because it has not named China as the fulcrum of its Indo-Pacific strategy. Of course, not very explicitly, but it did say about the rule of law, about the various other aspects like maritime security, maritime connectivity, and the free and open Indo-Pacific, and so on. These are indirect criticisms of China and indirectly addressing the China factor. So we do have a certain India's position. We do have a certain China strategy towards Indo-Pacific, although it is not said in open by China. So we have these two things to start with. So let me begin by saying, as Taniguchi-sensei had mentioned, there is also a certain context to why we are discussing today. In the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is a lot of attention of the NATO and European Union countries and the United States, and also, of course, Japan, South Korea, Australia, or other countries in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have had also the Russian foreign minister's visit to New Delhi a few days ago. So there is also the India factor here. But before the Ukrainian war, we saw that the Indo-Pacific strategy was on the upswing. And today, not many people speak about the Indo-Pacific strategy in the background of the Ukrainian crisis. It, of course, doesn't mean the Indo-Pacific strategy has been put on the back burner. On the contrary, as you may have seen, the third virtual meeting of the Quad leaders, US, Japan, Australia, and India, the leaders have discussed about the Ukrainian issue, and they have had some positions on this. So in other words, the Indo-Pacific strategy is still quite vibrant, and the vibrancy has gained more momentum after the United States had withdrawn from Afghanistan. The international security assistance forces have been withdrawn. So there are too many variables that are at work today to define whether the Indo-Pacific strategy is important or not. So the fundamental things, the determinants here, obviously are the economic growth rates have been shifting from the transatlantic towards that of the Indo-Pacific. We have seen with the substantial GDP, gross domestic product, that the Indo-Pacific region has reflected more than half of the global production. And the number of people, population-wise, the kind of prosperity the region has been generating, and for other factors like energy production and consumption, or climate change issues, or disaster relief aspects. So these have resulted in the Indo-Pacific strategy, or Indo-Pacific as such, becoming very prominent in the global arena. So despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine and seemingly shifting global attention towards the US, NATO, EU, and Ukraine, we a lot of emphasis on Indo-Pacific strategy, number one. Number two, we have seen that in terms of the indicators on shipping, trade, or even military expenditure in this region increasing. Global shipping has been one of the prominent features of the Indo-Pacific trade. Despite the COVID-19 supply chain disruptions, we have seen still the Indo-Pacific region is famous for its trade, of course, mainly centered around China. But with the RCEP signed last year, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the supply chain resilience has begun. There are also other initiatives like the Blue Dot Network and the day before yesterday signing of Australia-India interim trade agreement with the background of India concluding similar agreements with UK, UAE, and Israel in the not so distant future. We probably will see that the trade aspect is going to rebound. We have also seen the defense expenditure is quite high in the Indo-Pacific region. So we have a certain strategy that China had adopted. I would suggest that these include basically at the political level, a critique of blocks and encirclement by China. Chinese political leaders have already begun a certain discourse saying that the Indo-Pacific and the Quad are triggers of the recent bloc creation, as Foreign Minister Wang Yi mentioned, or the Foreign Ministry of China mentioned in terms of encirclement. These images of the long telegram that the 1945 connoted to the Cold War, those have been sought to be resurrected by China. And many Indians are quite familiar with this argument about encirclement as China increases its arms transfer to Pakistan and puts up the Hambantota port on a 99-year lease. And today, Sri Lankan economy is in doldrums. And we have also seen Pakistan as a basket case with the recent developments that we witnessed. Nepal is also an emerging area of the arc of destabilization, as has been mentioned previously by some Chinese scholars. At the economic level, China's strategy in the Indo-Pacific is obviously the largest trading partner for over 120 countries, including in the Indo-Pacific region. For example, China-Japan trade is quite high, as with the China-South Korea trade. China-ASEAN trade, which was surprisingly has become the largest trading partner for China with over $700 billion. And despite the murmurs on China-Australia relations, after the World Health Assembly intervention by Australia on the COVID-19 origins and the Chinese restrictions on the Australian products, despite that, we see that the Chinese are still the largest trading partner for many a country in the region. I just mentioned about the RCEP, and you have also the CPTPP, which is now getting traction. So that is the economic strategy of China in the Indo-Pacific to consolidate its economic footprint, both in terms of trade, investments, and the spread of the market economy. And at the third diplomatic level, China's strategy is to emphasize on ASEAN centrality, although we see that a lot of divide and rule is actually being practiced on the issue of the South China Sea islands, where China's support to Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, or other countries is on the upswing, while they were struggling to come across the code of conduct on the South China Sea. So while China parrots out the ASEAN centrality related matters, there is also the drive that China makes in the South China Sea islands dispute. We've also seen in the recent times the wolf warrior diplomacy as a part of the overall China's Indo-Pacific strategy. When we look at the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson's comments or their policies vis-a-vis other countries. We have also seen coercive diplomatic practices that China conducts. We have seen, for instance, last September, there is the Coast Guard law that was passed by China, which restricts the entry of ships in the South China Sea region. Indians are also familiar with this because in 2009, we had the INS Airawat incident when the Indian ship was shooed away by the Chinese Coast Guard and other elements in the South China Sea. So that's the third strategy by China at the diplomatic level. Fourth, in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, China obviously has a very high expenditure in the defense-related matters and is now focusing much of that in the maritime domain. We have seen, for instance, the Chinese have conducted over 38 missions to the Indian Ocean region in terms of the counter-piracy operations, although according to the International Maritime Organization, the piracy incidents in South China Sea are more to the Indian Ocean region or the coast of Somalia. So this is surprising, and we see that China consolidated its position by having a Djibouti naval base, and there is a lot of momentum also in Gwadar and Jimani bases. So that suggests to the military strategy of China, in addition to the two-ocean strategy that it had adopted in 2009 with Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean as the focal areas. At a broader strategy level, China is trying to address the Indo-Pacific region by its own Belt and Road Initiative, both in the continental domain and also in the maritime domain. So when we look at the Chinese profile in the Indo-Pacific, we see that there is a lot of focus here in the economic sphere, in technological global commons, or in the discussions related to the code of conduct or other activities. To summarize this aspect, let me say that the Chinese strategies in the Indo-Pacific region are important today to see the impact it has on various sectors. We have seen, for instance, since the reform and opening up policies, China has increased its maritime focus, and as a result of that, we see China today is the largest producer of over 220 categories of industrial products, including steel, cement, and automobiles. For example, China produces nearly half of global steel and 54% of global cement production. And today there is also nearly 40% of global machine tools and 41% of ships, including very large crude containers, and over 60% of power generation equipment. And the overall Chinese GDP contains more than 40% of exports and imports. China's GDP last year was about $17.9 trillion. That's about roughly $18 trillion. 40% of this was in the export and import dimensions, mainly in the maritime area, which is where the Indo-Pacific strategy becomes quite crucial. So let me turn to the mapping India's position in this overall context of the Chinese strategy. For India, the determinants include that India sees this as an opportunity, partly because during the Cold War, India was confined to South Asia, both by the United States and by China, who treated India no more than a South Asian country But with nearly $3 trillion of GDP today, it cannot be confined to South Asia. And the Indo-Pacific strategy enhances the Indian outreach into the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific Ocean regions. Secondly, one of the main determinants of India in the Indo-Pacific strategy is its 7,500 kilometers of coastline and the control and management of over 1,200 islands, and the protection and development of the exclusive economic zone of nearly 2 million square kilometers. So that's the huge responsibility that India has undertaken in terms of the Indian Ocean region. In fact, the Indian naval doctrine mentions about the primary focus and secondary focus. Primary mainly in the Indian Ocean region and secondary in the South China Sea as well as the Persian Gulf. So it had the vast expanse of this Indian Ocean region as the arena extended up to the South China Sea. There is the Indian consideration on the maritime domain, given the Mumbai attacks by the terrorists from Pakistan, what we generally call as 26/11 incident. And so this is a major concern for India. That is the cross-border terrorism and terrorism through the seas, as the Mumbai incident indicated. Finally, the other determinant that India has is obviously India is growing. Is one of the largest. It's the highest economic growth rate clocking country among the developing countries. And so this is a main factor. It had jumped up ease of doing business thrice, and the GDP is increasing. There is also the geographical position in the Indian Ocean region. There is a rise in the middle class in India, and the growth rates, consumption patterns are increasing. So increasingly then, the Indian merger with the Indo-Pacific region is also a major defining factor in this Indo-Pacific strategy. A few dynamics that we have seen recently as a part of the mapping of India's position in the Indo-Pacific is we have seen Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spoke about the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Indian Parliament discussions way back in 2007. I suspect Taniguchi Sensei had a major role in this formulation at that point of time, and subsequently in terms of sustaining this concept. Initially, there were many reservations, or including in India, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe mentioned about the arc of prosperity and freedom. Dr. Manmohan Singh, the then Prime Minister, mentioned about the arc of peace and stability rather than prosperity and freedom. So these are all loaded terms which suggest that the strategies that each was following had a different element. But we see now that Prime Minister Modi, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Secretary, are all on the same page while mentioning about the rule of law, the free and open Indo-Pacific, the kind of prosperity, freedom, and so on and so forth, which were the original 2007 script that was presented to the Indian Parliament. So we see a lot of sea change in India's position. For example, the Shangri-La speech by Prime Minister Modi mentions about all the elements that we just discussed. In fact, he mentioned 11 times during the June 1st, 2018 speech to the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. And of course, he mentioned about the inclusive architecture and ASEAN centrality. and unity are the main factors. We did see a kind of close association between the Japanese vision on the Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific strategy of India, as well as the ASEAN outlook that has been presented by the Southeast Asian grouping. More concretely, at the East Asian Summit meeting in 2019, Prime Minister Modi mentioned about the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative. So that is where India had emphasized 7 features, including on maritime security, ecology, resources, capacity building, disaster risk reduction measures, and its management, science and technology, and academic cooperation, trade, connectivity, and maritime transport. So those are the areas where India had confined itself to in the emerging Indo-Pacific strategy. And in terms of geography, there is the suggestion that the Indian concept of Indo-Pacific has a succession of semicircles all across this region. So the innermost semicircle is where we see the closest neighbors. And this dovetails into India's policy on neighborhood first. And that is where the importance of Indo-Pacific also comes in. But also, in terms of sharing the civilizational and cultural heritage with that region, South Asian region. So there is this arc of outer neighborhood, which covers broadly the Gulf states in West Asia and Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries, but also expands to the Horn of Africa, into the Western Indian Ocean, and to the Straits of Malaccas. So when President Obama and Prime Minister Modi signed the 2015 Joint Vision Statement, both of these regions, Indian Ocean and South China Sea, have come into the picture. And that is where this strategy is now being implemented. Not so much in the South China Sea, but with the merger of the or change of the Look-East policy into Act-East policy since 2015, there are a number of institutional arrangements that are being worked out with several Southeast Asian and East Asian countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Singapore, and the ASEAN Regional Forum, BIMSTEC, and the Mekong Ganga Cooperation and IORA. All of these now into some kind of an arrangement in multilateral format. So this is what we have at the moment in terms of the mapping of India's position. So with the Quad, of course, Quad is different from the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific came about when the Trump administration initiated the Da Nang meeting in November 2017. They have had the 7 areas as focal elements in that Indo-Pacific. The medium-level officials mentioned about the free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based order, freedom of navigation and overflight, respect for international law, connectivity, maritime security, North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile proliferation, counterterrorism, and other issues. So in terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific, there is a suggestion by all the 4 countries, US, Japan, Australia, and India, about the shared vision that they have on long-term interests of looking at this region more closely with this shared vision, as they mentioned in several documents. But in the light of the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in 2016 on 4 counts in the South China Sea, when the Filipinos have gone to the court, there is the rules-based order that has been upheld by these countries. We have seen, for example, India had abided by the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling on the UNCLOS with Bangladesh and Myanmar when it has to give up some islands when the ruling went against India. On the other hand, China walked away from the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling when it went into the arbitration procedures. So the rules-based order is reflective of this background when India had abided by the UNCLOS treaties and other maritime issues. There is the connectivity aspect. In 2019, there was the Bangkok meeting in which it was decided that there will be a division of labor between these four countries. The United States spending more in terms of technologies and others, while Japan financing much of the high-tech manufacturing zones, even as United States focuses on energy projects, while Australia will be in the distribution format, and in the case of India, building up maritime ports like Sabang in Indonesia or Tabahar in Iran. So there is a certain division of labor that has been worked out between these four countries. There is also the debate about expanding the Indo-Pacific, with UK, France, Germany showing interest, as well as Indonesia, South Korea, and Vietnam also expressing interest in this aspect. So this meant a complete overhaul of the Cold War structures. And here, let me say that Japan and India have a lot to gain compared to the Cold War confines of the East-West confrontation. So we do see a number of triggers for the Indo-Pacific countries to thrive in the Indo-Pacific region. So when we map India's position, we see that there are several opportunities that it had been looking at. There is the Blue Dot network that I referred to before, and with the former US Secretary of State Pompeo mentioning about the IDFC, International Development Finance Corporation, and its funding increased, we see that there is a lot more interest now in the infrastructure, in addition to, of course, the Build Back Better World initiative, which plans to invest over $45 trillion. So let me summarize by saying that India's position on Indo-Pacific today has become much more forthcoming compared to the 2007 when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe addressed the Indian Parliament. Today, US, Japan, Australia, and India see themselves at the four corners of the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. There has been an increase in the level of interaction at a bureaucratic level to that of a ministerial level, and now to the political level, Prime Minister, President levels of interaction. So the level has been substantially increased, and the subjects that they are also discussing has increased. The membership criteria is becoming much more interesting, with the European countries joining this format and also conducting naval exercises in the South China Sea. So we do see this Indo-Pacific strategy increasing in its format, while China's IP strategy, if there is one, is getting more confined to its Belt and Road Initiative or other formats that it had worked out. So it's an interesting kind of signal, but in positive terms for the Indo-Pacific countries who have proposed the Indo-Pacific idea. So let me stop here, and I'm willing to take questions from the chair as well as the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kondapalli. That was comprehensive and succinct, to the point. And I think the audience has learned a lot, as much as I have. Now, before taking questions, may I ask you, fellow members of the audience, to put your short question to the chat box. And I see only 3. Before having more, let me tell you just a little bit to supplement what we have heard from Professor Kondapalli of the genesis of the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It was in 1980, 42 years ago, when Japanese Prime Minister, then Japanese Prime Minister, called Masayoshi Ohira, went to Canberra, and he met Prime Minister Fraser of Australia. Together, they started to talk extensively about Asia Pacific. Indeed, it was Japan and Australia that engineered the birth of APEC. The 1980s and the 1990s arguably were the eras, were the decades of Asia Pacific. What was missing there was India. And it was Shinzo Abe, as Professor Kondapalli told us, who addressed the Joint House of Indian Parliament in the summer of 2007 under the title Confluence of the Two Seas, who first gave a footlight to the importance of the growth of India. So Asia Pacific is passé because it excludes India. Indo-Pacific must be the word to be used by our generation and the future generation in order to incorporate the growth and the increasing role of India. So that was what I just wanted to add. Professor Kondapalli, would you like to address some of these questions? For instance, the first question is broad. Does China camouflage her imperial aspirations with socialistic political ideology? I think that's the question that can be divided into 2 parts. Does China have something called imperial aspirations? And the second part is, does China hide that aspiration? Would you like to address that question, Professor Kondapalli?
Yes. Thank you very much for raising that question. There is the Chinese aspirations. They, as Colin Powell, former Secretary of State, mentioned in his interactions with the Chinese, he raised an objection to what the Chinese called a century of humiliation with the Opium Wars and various other cutting the Chinese melon, as we remember in Chinese history books. So the Chinese have been publicizing the century of humiliation debate since the first Opium War in 1842 till what Colin Powell mentioned till 2004. And he said he objected to this because China has become the second largest economy by 2010. And there is, as Wolfowitz mentioned about the responsible stakeholder debate. So the debate on the century of humiliation has been passé in China, given the G2 US-China related understanding about the global order. Number 1 point. Number 2 is the Chinese at the 19th Communist Party Congress. President Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping, mentioned in his work report that he wanted China to occupy the center stage. The Bidhan College Science Department, I'm sure, knows what center stage means in political science. Center stage meaning occupying the global power centers. That is what the Americans used to occupy and still do to a large extent in terms of the economic power, the political power, and so on. So interestingly, Xi Jinping suggested that China would be moving in that direction. So to answer your question on the imperial aspirations, they mentioned both the century of humiliation as a process to resurrect China's rise. Secondly, in terms of the occupying the center stage, that is the global power centers, and the international order, how to influence the international order. Many of the statements, for example, the Xi Jinping statement in Shanghai in the CICA summit meeting in May 2014, where he mentioned that Asian countries should look after their own security, meaning thereby that the Americans should withdraw from Asia, which they did soon after the Subic Bay and Cam Bay were vacated by the then Soviet Union and by the US from the Philippines in 1991, which benefited a lot for China and to the subsequent China's rise in the ASEAN region. So it did contribute to the imperial aspirations of China. All these that I just. The second aspect of your question is the socialist political ideology. Now, at the 19th Communist Party Congress, the General Secretary of the party mentioned about community of common destiny. And we do not know exactly what does that mean, but it is couched in socialist political ideology, along with the concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics under the new era. This new era is the era of Xi Jinping. And so there is the socialist political ideology that has been emphasized once again in the 19th Party Congress. Now, what does community of common destiny mean for Indo-Pacific? Basically is, although they never define, except for Xi Jinping's statement in the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, that it is about partnerships, economic, military, political, etc., partnerships. But when we look at the Chinese arrangements with many a country, these are a tight embrace. For example, with Pakistan, with Nepal, with Sri Lanka, with many other countries like Laos, Cambodia, or others, the community of common destiny is becoming much more tighter in its embrace. What it then means is, for any country which rises in the international system, it has to have allies and friends, and that is where the community of common destiny, now packaged in socialist political ideological terms, is what is projecting China into the international domain, along, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative. So to just answer Prabir Kanti's question, there is the imperial aspirations as well as the socialist political ideology that is reflected in China's futuristic projects. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's been very much an interesting observation, which inspires me to raise a couple of questions myself based on Prabir Kanti's question as well. When you say imperial aspirations, one has to define what sort of empire China is looking at. if any? Please enlighten us on that point, Professor Kondapalli. That's number one. Number two, I am also curious about what lessons Xi Jinping is learning at this point, observing the tremendous failure, if I have to say, of Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. Russia has succeeded in isolating itself very much from the international community. And what kind of lessons Xi Jinping should like to learn from that utter failure of Russia? So first point, what kind of empire, if any, China is looking at or envisaging? Number two, what kind of lessons Xi Jinping may or may not have learned in the aftermath of Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you. I think the common thread that we see from many of the political leaders since Mao Zedong, in 1949, Mao Zedong said, China is at the center of gravity in Asia. He was speaking to a Southeast Asian leader, and he mentioned about this center of gravity in Asia. So that's a very powerful expression to suggest that the Chinese still aspire to a middle kingdom status. That is, it is at the center of gravity. Of course, the Cold War period was not so nice to China. And what it basically means, you had the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1954, and you had the Korean War before, you have the US trade embargoes and so on and so forth. Till Nixon's visit, China's aspirations were not yet fulfilled. And this is where we see China now emphasizing on its rise. Remember, three things were concluded during Deng Xiaoping's visit to the White House in February 1979. One is a joint disintegration of the Soviet Union. Both suggested to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The Chinese were criticizing the Soviets as social imperialists in the 60s and 70s because of the Chenpao Tao Ussuriski River incidents, the territorial dispute and ideological conflicts and others, including the Afghanistan position as well as Mongolia and Indochina, that is Laos, Cambodia situation in contrast to the Vietnamese position. So the Chinese were playing up with the United States for the disintegration of the then Soviet Union. So we saw the Chinese and the CIA propping up the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The second deal that Deng Xiaoping had was with Jimmy Carter was how to rise in the international system. So we see the Wall Street, the later on the Silicon Valley, later on the manufacturing sector, they were giving a huge uplift to the Chinese, and we saw the lock, stock, barrel, shift towards China. So much so today there are 70,000 American companies functioning in China with $700 billion of investment. Not just the Americans, but their own allies as well. The European countries, Japan, South Korea. Japan has over 83,000 companies in China today, and had some $300 billion of investment, in addition to the ODA and others. South Korea similarly, or Singapore or other countries in a similar fashion. So this is what is behind China's rise, or resurrecting China into a middle kingdom status today. If Yan Xuetung and other faculty members at Tsinghua University, if they are suggesting that China should now resurrect the Middle Kingdom, it is because of this stock that China had been able to raise because of the arrangements with the Americans and American allies. And we saw the impact in terms of China becoming the second largest economy in the world. So that was the second deal. The third deal was in terms of stability in the Taiwan Straits that Deng Xiaoping stuck with Jimmy Carter. And this is where we saw till recently the agreement being in place. It is now, of course, since late Trump, we saw the tariff wars increasing. We saw the American officials' visits to Taiwan increasing. We saw the South China Sea freedom of navigation operations becoming very intensive. We also see the sanctions on Uyghur issue and TPSA, Tibet Policy Support Act, or others. This suggests there is a certain confrontation. So to just summarize the imperialist ambitions, China's reform and opening up with the blessings of the US has created this second largest economy in the world today, which can say no to the Americans, as we saw during the late Trump policies or early Biden policies so far. So that is what the imperial ambitions is. Successive leaders in China since Mao Zedong wanted to resurrect the Middle Kingdom with the concepts of Wei Yuan, a 19th century philosopher, maritime philosopher, with the concept of Foucault Chiangping, rich country, strong army, which used to be a Qing dynasty aspiration. And of course, the tributary paying states, which is part of the Middle Kingdom syndrome. So this is what the imperial ambitions are at the political level. Secondly, when we look at the white papers issued by China, they have issued nearly 10 white papers on national defense and 2 work conferences related to foreign affairs, Central Affairs Foreign Affairs Work Conference, in which Xi Jinping mentioned that China wants to control the maritime domains. So this is something like what Admiral Cheng He did in 1327 till 1360s, where they have gone up to Tanzania, almost ruling over these oceans. So the 2015 white paper, 2019 white paper, they mention about the maritime focus of the PLA. And this is where the imperial ambitions are getting renewed from Cheng He's expedition, the 7 expeditions that he carried forward in that period. So those are the imperial ambitions that I can recall. The second question that was raised is in terms of the current developments in Ukraine. Now, China on the one hand suggests that it respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries, and it follows the UN Charter in this regard. However, it does not mention if this is applicable to Ukraine or to Russia or to China or to any other country. So what we have seen is a bland statement that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a country should be respected. They don't mention about Ukraine. Of course, Ambassador Fan in Ukraine, in Kyiv last week, mentioned that China supports Ukraine. But on the other hand, we saw the February 4th joint statement between President Xi Jinping and President Putin that there are no limits to the cooperation between the two sides. And there are no forbidden areas of strategic partnership between the two sides. So we find a different signaling here from China, both on Ukraine as well as their policies in relation to Russia. So it's a disjuncture that we see in China's foreign policy. Number two, we have also seen the coordination between China and Russia. For example, the February 24th was the closing ceremony of the Beijing Winter Olympics, and that was the start of the war in Ukraine as well. So, as the New York Times mentioned, there is a certain coordination between Putin and Xi in terms of when the war should start, after the closing of the Winter Olympics or before that. So we saw finally a day after these sports events completed, Russia took the military action in Ukraine. This suggests to the, while Ambassador Fan mentioned something to the Ukrainians, on the other hand, we see a lot of coordination between China and Russia on this count. Incidentally, when Biden and Xi spoke in the virtual summit, Biden suggested that China should not provide material support. We don't know exactly what material support that China could provide to Russia, but the speculation is about the drones that China could supply to Russia because of the Turkish Bakhtiar drones, quite successful in the Ukrainian war. Secondly, in terms of sanctions that Russia is facing, and on the SWIFT system, that China could provide some, assistance to the Russians. So, in addition to, of course, energy and other aspects. So, this is where we saw that material support could be provided by China to Russia. It is still not a explicit case. We do not see much cooperation, at least on paper, right now. And this is partly because China earns more money with trade from US, European Union, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, than compared with the $140 billion they get from Russia. The combined trade between China, US, EU, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN is nearly $3 trillion compared to $140 billion with Russia. So China tends to lose more when it has to kind of support Russia in this conflict in Ukraine. Number one. Number two is some Chinese WeChat conversation mentioned about Russian military action in Ukraine can be replicated to Taiwan. They have also mentioned the Garry Kasparov observation on Taiwan, the chess player or others. But the two are completely different. Ukraine has a border, land border, through which the Russians have been able to create a bridge, a land bridge in Donbass, as well as in Crimea. In the case of Taiwan, it has a water moat, which is about 180 nautical miles on an average. So it would be really tough on the part of China to even contemplate invading Taiwan. We did see that Russia is facing a lot of music in Ukraine after they have initiated the skirmishes. Likewise, if the Chinese military takes any action in Taiwan Straits, Taiwan is no Ukraine in terms of modernization of its armed forces. And the Xiongfeng missile systems that Zhongshan Institute of Science and Technology develops is quite modern. And they have a 2,000-kilometer range cruise missiles and other standoff weapon systems. In addition, of course, the Taiwanese military being highly professional. So this suggests the costs for China are going to be much more higher than compared to what we are witnessing now for Russia. So the second aspect on the learning lessons on Ukraine is don't step forward on Taiwan Straits. So my guess is it will be much more political rhetoric rather than military action on Taiwan. In this context, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe mentioned about the nuclear deployments, and former Deputy Prime Minister Taro also mentioned about the support to Taiwan by Japan. And so those are interesting aspects. While NATO has not come to the rescue of Ukraine, nor the United States so far in any full-blown manner, but we see there is an increasing Japanese interest in supporting Taiwan in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. So we should factor this also as part of the Xi Jinping's learning on Ukrainian developments.
Thank you. Most interesting. Indeed, Shinzo Abe, Taro Aso, an increasing number of Japanese prominent politicians are now talking about following West Germany's course by having nuclear weapons jointly with the United States under the so-called dual key system. But that aside, here is a question, a short one about Sri Lanka. Would you like to answer that question, Professor Kondapalli? What sort of role Sri Lanka should and could play in the context of Indo-Pacific, China's Pacific, Indo-Pacific strategy?
That's a good question, pretty difficult to answer because Sri Lanka has not expressed its opinion to join. But in the light of the Quad Plus and the Indo-Pacific Plus, the February White House document on Indo-Pacific mentions about the expansion of the Indo-Pacific to include mainly European partners. And they have also suggested to South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam as potential new members in the Indo-Pacific strategy. So since this came from the US, this document, and the mention about European countries' interest in the Indo-Pacific, the idea of expansion of the Quad as well as the Indo-Pacific, by the way, these are two different things, Indo-Pacific and Quad. But nevertheless, I was trying to interrelate. While Sri Lanka has not expressed its interest in the Indo-Pacific idea, and it appears to be inexorably attracted into the Chinese orbit, like the Rajapakshas are pretty close to China in terms of the funding, political campaign funding, in terms of Hambantota, which is the constituency of the Rajapakshas, political constituency, the Colombo Port Project, or other Belt and Road Initiative projects. This suggests that Sri Lanka today has not shown much interest in the Indo-Pacific. So this question doesn't arise because they have not expressed any interest in this. Having said that, Sri Lanka also is in the Indian Ocean. And so obviously this comes under the overall format of the Indo-Pacific strategy. That is how we see Pompeo's visit to Sri Lanka last year, 2 years ago, and the visits by Indian, Japanese leaders to Sri Lanka. For example, Japan and India are coordinating for projects in the maritime areas in Sri Lanka, in addition to, of course, the other infrastructure projects. So we may possibly see the implementation of Indo-Pacific strategy in Sri Lanka. But the main question today is, will the Rajapakshas allow that kind of a strategy to be implemented?
Thank you very much. It is just about time for us to bring this tremendously important and interesting session to close. But before that, may I say, number one, I have learned quite a bit from Professor Kondapalli's seasoned observations on China. And I was particularly interested in the way in which Professor Kondapalli described the so-called imperial aspirations of the Chinese. Professor Kondapalli mentioned a number of times that the Chinese would very much like to take a center stage once again by reviving its so-called Middle Kingdom. And perhaps he also mentioned that Chinese may be interested in having, once again, a suzerain tributary relationship. On that point, I must say, Japan's been a proud outlier of Sino-centric international order. Indeed, there was a short period of time in Japanese history in which Japanese shogun sent gifts in order to get recognition as a king of Japan from the Chinese emperor. But that was very much a short period of time of 70 plus years. So Japan's been in a very much an outlier position, proudly so, in the Sino-centric international order. I, for one, would not like to deal with China on bended knees. And when it comes to India-Japan relationship, it is mutual respect that binds these two nations together. India has never looked down upon Japan. Japan has never looked down upon India. So it's a much more comfortable, may I say, relationship that Japan has with India. Please let me close this session with that rather positive note of mine. And the microphone is to you, Prashant Kumar Sharma. Once again, thank you very much for hosting this fascinating and instructive session with Professor Kondapalli.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. May I now invite our student, Miss Susma Raut, to kindly deliver a vote of thanks. Susma, are you there?
Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks to all who have helped us in making this international webinar such a resounding success. At the very outside, we would like to extend our profound thanks and gratitude to our Vice Principal, Sir, Dr. Rameskar, the head of the institution, for granting his approval and providing his perennial support and encouragement towards the successful conduct of this webinar. We express the heartiest thanks to His Excellency Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi, Sir, Special Advisor to former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan, for accepting our invitation and taking out time from his busy schedule to chair this webinar. Sir, your encouraging participation as a chair has transmuted this occasion into a thought-provoking and vibrant academic event. Thank you very much, sir. We extend our heartiest thanks and gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Professor Srikant Kondapalli, Sir, Dean at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, for accepting our invitation despite his both tight administration and academic engagements. We also thank you for not only sparing your invaluable time with us, but for illuminating us with your constructive and captivating the ideas concerning the various aspects of the India's position in China's Indo-Pacific strategy. We look forward to have many more opportunities to hear your thoughts and ideas. Thank you very much, sir. Now, we would like to thank to the President of the governing body of our institution, Dr. Sudipta Roy, and all the members of the governing body for their constant moral support to our webinar. Our thanks also go to the Dr. Subhajit Ghosh, Sir Bursar and NAC coordinator at our institution, and to Professor Sadhunath Kundu Sir, coordinator of the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, and Professor Prabir Kanti Basu, Sir Secretary, Teachers Council for their continued moral support. We deeply acknowledge the unwavering support and guidance received from Professor Devdas Desai, head at the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much, sir. We would like to extend our sincere and heartiest thanks to Professor Prashant Kumar Sharma, sir, assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, for taking up the initiative to organize this webinar. Thank you very much, sir. We would also like to thank Dr. Abdul Khalik, sir, an assistant professor at the Department of Physics, and all the members of the seminar and webinar committee for providing all the technical assistance required. Our vote of thanks also go to Professor Deptanu Maji, sir, Professor Kamal Roy, and Professor Anandita Mitra, ma'am, all the Department of Political Science for their continued support in organizing this webinar. We extend our heartiest thanks to all the teaching and non-teaching staff at our institution for their moral support. A special thanks goes to all the students of the Department of Political Science for enthusiastically coordinating and supporting the webinar by showing fervor interest from the very beginning. Last but not the least, our sincere thanks go to all the respected participants present here for their active participation and for making this event a huge success. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Susma. Thank you for the vote of thanks. I also acknowledge your efforts in organizing this webinar. I once again thank you all for your auspicious participation. We hope to see you all again in our forthcoming programs. Wishing you all the best and a wonderful time ahead. Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you very much. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.